In the mid '90s, an old Jewish man would throw a bunch of drug addicts in the ring and tell them to hit each other with vacuums. They called it ECW. But before, wrestlers like Mick Foley and such were blowing themselves up and hitting each other with keyboards. There was a guy whose body shape would make Dusty Rhodes look like Monica Bellucci's. His name was Abdullah the Butcher. I popped Pat. I'm good.
That's the only way you can ever reference Monica Bellucci on a 70s wrestling podcast.
She's been on my mind since Beetlejuice. So Abdullah the Butcher was born in 1941, and he's actually Canadian. He had a reputation for being involved in some of the most violent and bloody hardcore wrestling matches of all time, hence my ridiculous intro of him. Over his time in wrestling, he was given the moniker the Madman from Sudan, despite the fact that he was from fucking
Windsor,
Canada.
Ontario, Canada.
Yeah, there's so much of that in wrestling. I am the Iron Sheik. You're from Tampa. That's what I am the original Sheik. Okay, you're from Detroit. Calm down. So Gavin, let's talk about Abdullah the Butcher and what he meant to wrestling in the 70s, because he's one of these guys that so much of what people think of wrestling now comes from ECW, but so much of ECW happens because of, Japan, but also Abdullah the Butcher.
Well, first, happy birthday to the man that Arn Anderson affectionately refers to as the Walrus, Paul Heyman, 59 today. But yeah, Abdullah was, think of the best way to phrase this. There were, in the 1970s, there were two heels that stood above everyone else in terms of name recognition and ability to draw anywhere in the country. Because typically, when you thought about who was drawing for territories in those days, it was your babyface acts. It was a babyface Dusty Rhodes. It was Andre the Giant. It was the Von Erich family. It was Junkyard Dog. And so when you talk about heels that were able to move from territory to territory and genuinely draw a house on name value and on, at that point in wrestling history, genuine fear of what people were going to see. There were two. There were the Sheik from Detroit,
right,
and there was Abdullah the Butcher.
Not the Iron Sheik, by the way, for the youngins.
Yes.
No, Ed Farhat.
The original Sheik of Detroit.
Yeah.
Sabu's what? Uncle? Grandfather?
Uncle.
Yeah. That's what I
thought. And so Abdullah, through his portrayal of this maniac that could not speak English, that had one of the greatest 1,000-yard stares in any form of media.
It has to be put into context. It's the 70s. We're having a few problems with the Middle East.
Yes. Yes.
That's not what's happening today.
No, we seem to have resolved most of it.
The bug-eyed 1,000-yard stare in every promo shot. His willingness to do things like put salmonella-infested raw chicken into his mouth to give the portrayal of a madman. And as everyone on this panel knows, the ever-present fork.
Which do you think would upset modern youngins today? Kamala or Abdullah the Butcher? Just going to throw that out there.
Kamala.
Okay.
Isn't it ironic, though, that their last names are both Harris, meaning Kamala and Kamala? Just saying.
It is.
I still own the Kamala Ugandan Headhunter skin T-shirt.
Oh, amazing.
Which he was selling on Pro Wrestling Tees. Keep going, Gavin.
Sure was.
Abdullah had the ability to terrify a crowd because this was in an era when wrestling was still real. And they believed that this was truly an uncontrollable maniac from halfway around the world.
He was chasing people with a fork.
Yeah, and the fact that, everybody that got in the ring against him bled buckets, and so did he, it only lent credibility to what he was doing. And I certainly don't necessarily think that someone needs to go to the extremes that Abdullah did to present themselves in such a realistic and believable way. But I do think that wrestlers in every promotion at this point would be well served to try to craft that type of believability around who they are. Now, I know the Beast Mordos. I don't think anybody's ever going to buy into the fact that he's an actual Minotaur.
Wait, Luchasaurus isn't a dinosaur?
He's a hybrid.
Can I tell you,
The Outrunners are the youngest men alive, though.
My son and I watched All Out this past weekend, and he saw something on it that looks completely stupid. It's AEW. Could have been anything.
The whole show, yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, no, this is tame by comparison. So I showed him the Yeti, who was molesting Hulk Hogan. I showed him, what is it? Not the Minotaur, but the thing
Mantor?
Mantor! Yes, I showed him Mantor. To which
How dare you, sir? Mantor, the spiritual successor of Moose Cholak.
Yeah, I showed him, what do you call it? The gobbledygooker, to which he snorted milk through his nose. But to the point, I showed him the Halloween Havoc where they electrocuted
the
Abdullah the
Chamber
Butcher.
of Horrors.
Yes, I showed him that, and I'm bringing it up because we're talking about Abdullah the Butcher, and that is my lasting memory of that poor bastard, besides his run in XPW when I worked for the company, of him sitting in Grandpa's chair and acting like he's being electrocuted by doing this maneuver here.
So for me, I certainly remember that.
Sure, who doesn't?
But for me, the lasting memory that I have and the most vivid memory that I have of Abdullah the Butcher actually comes from territory we talked about briefly earlier, World Class.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the first exposure that I had to Abdullah was his feud in World Class with Bruiser Brody. And eventually Bruiser working underneath the hood as Red River Jack. And one of the things that was so vivid about that to me was it was Bruiser Brody wearing long jeans and cowboy boots and a stark white mask over his head, and Abdullah jabbing him with the fork and blood coming through that red mask.
How genius is that visual to go with? Like,
and that feud between Abdullah and Bruiser Brody, that was Abdullah to me. Things got silly in late 80s NWA WCW. But that Abdullah Bruiser Brody feud, that'll always be Abdullah to me.
Unfortunately, my first recollection of Abdullah is Sting opening a gift box.
If he comes out of a box, he'll be over.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. But there was a point in time where WCW decided that Sting's so over, we can make him look like the world's biggest idiot every week by continually opening boxes where people attack him and never learn his lesson.
Like, I remember if he comes out of a box, he'll be over thing. And I kind of remember the thing with Abdullah the Butcher. I didn't realize that was an ongoing gag.
Cactus Jack appeared out of a box and beat the hell out of him.
Medusa
Abdullah appeared out of a box and beat the hell out of him.
At what point did anyone tell Sting stop opening boxes?
He finally got the hint when Lex Luger injured his knee out of a caravan. After Medusa came and did a dance for him. But in fairness, I would have been distracted by that too. Anyway, but my first real memory of Abdullah is that WCW run where he was a gift box attacker of Sting, and then was Sting's tag team partner in the Battle Bowl drawing, and didn't know what to do, and then eventually feuded with Cactus. But we had a weird UHF station here in New York that would play a company called International World Class Championship Wrestling. Say that 3 times fast.
That's the Savoldi's promotion?
Yes.
Yep.
So
we got that on cable access here as well.
Right. Weirdly, however, they had a deal with the World Wrestling Council from Puerto Rico, which was, a promotion that's kind of notorious for its history. We won't go into the Brody murder and everything, but
it gets a bit stabby.
Yeah, but maybe more so than any other promotion in the world, Abdullah really could call that one home.
Yep.
And if there's a more notorious feud than Abdullah's feud with Bruiser Brody, it's his feud with, the Puerto Rican hero Carlos Colon, who was also the promoter of WWC. And those, much like Brody, it was just a never-ending battle. And IWCCW, because they were partners with WWC in a lot of respects, were airing footage of that. And so I got to see some of the Abdullah versus Carlos matches. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Because it was like watching a slaughterhouse happen.
It was kind of startling going from Rochester Roadblock versus Jumpin' Joey Maggs
Oh my,
to the bloodbath of Abdullah the Butcher versus Carlos Colon.
where each guy who comes into the match with a forehead full of scars goes ahead and just profusely stab each other with forks, hits each other with ring posts and chairs, everything between. And I'm just like, how is there no disqualification happening right now? This is not legal. People need to be arrested. This is what am I seeing here? And it's just
my ex-father-in-law,
oh,
his thing with boxing, as stupid as this is going to sound, but I am trying to make a point, would say if you did what they did in boxing, you would be arrested for a felony. And I said, yes, that's the difference between punching a guy in the street and a sport, you idiot. However, when it came to the stuff Abdullah the Butcher did, he's more right than wrong. If you did any of what Abdullah did,
yeah,
and he shouldn't have been doing any of those things.
Right, tell that to Hannibal. Anyway. So Abdullah, gave me hepatitis, and
Yes.
so I was just wondering if you could answer a few questions. Never mind. For the 5% of the audience who got that, I hope you enjoyed it. But I saw this bloodbath in Puerto Rico, and I was like, oh my God. And I realized at that point what a sanitized version of Abdullah I was seeing at the time on Turner Family Networks. And then my dad showed me some magazines and showed me some tapes, and I was seeing him against Manny Fernandez.
Oh, God.
They're bleeding buckets all over the ring. I was seeing him brought in to be the assassin against Tommy Rich in Georgia when Tommy was the #1 babyface on cable TV in the country.
Somebody say something about fired up.
The best Abdullah the Butcher feuds ended with images that would be out of a Sam Raimi Evil Dead movie.
And the one that will always stick with me is I saw him wrestle Scott Casey. Yeah, Scott Casey was probably best known for his time as a WWE jobber to the stars in the late 80s.
Yeah.
But Scott was a big star in Southwest. He was a known commodity. Scott had a good look, was a good worker, but wasn't an over-the-top, next-level guy. But for the Southwest Championship, Abdullah just mauled this guy. And until they invented the Muda scale, where Muda accidentally gigged himself way too deep, and until Eddie Guerrero gigged himself way too deep against JBL, I never saw anything where I felt so bad for somebody in something I knew was not real, but I was like, this crossed the line. This is real now.
Yeah.
Because Scott Casey bled out so profusely that I was like, this man could really maybe die from this.
I was going to say, over the decades-long career of Abdullah the Butcher, there are one or two incidents that he was involved with where the words "he could have died" were uttered.
And we talk about Abdullah and being a product of the time. The thing with his gimmick was kind of almost like Andre for a long time, but the heel version of it, that couldn't be sustainable in the same territory for a long time. With Andre, you couldn't be sustainable because Andre eventually, how's anybody going to beat this giant?
Right.
With Abdullah, it was because the act was so over the top and so crazy. We talk about what's called hot shot booking. Abdullah's gimmick is hot shot booking, essentially.
Yeah, it's funny. Triple H said at the end of the Attitude Era, we couldn't keep doing this. We were going to kill somebody.
Exactly. And it's the same mentality with Abdullah, where if he keeps doing this over and over again in the same territory, it's just not going to work at a certain point. He's not going to be over anymore. The act is stale. But because it was the territory system, it was a different time. You didn't have access to everything all at once. Abdullah could go and be in Georgia for 3 months and be over and everything is great. And guess what? Then Abdullah's going to bounce and go here, and Abdullah's going to go here. And he could go anywhere because his act was fresh everywhere because he never overstayed his welcome anywhere. And he was smart enough to realize that ahead of time, more than the bookers did. Because whenever they tried to bring him in, Abdullah goes, I'm available to you from here to here, and then I have to go here. And it made sense. And that's why when he stayed anywhere for a length of time, it was Puerto Rico. Because, and I'm not trying to, knock the audience there, that audience is perhaps the most bloodthirsty and violent crazed
Well, these are
audience.
the people who, a normal audience throws tomatoes when you fail. They threw batteries before it even started.
They threw batteries, what we call an East LA water balloon, which is a condom filled with piss.
Sure. I mean, who
They,
doesn't?
They forced an NWA world title change for Ric Flair to Jack Venmo, just
Veneno,
out of.
yeah.
I mean, yeah,
They threw asbestos. They
Yeah.
ripped asbestos off of the stadium during a riot and threw it at, of all people, Haku.
Yeah.
And JJ Dillon was there, and he said it hit Haku from probably a pretty great height, all things considered. And he didn't go down, but he wobbled. And just the fact that the audience...
To be clear, that's Haku. A normal man would be dead.
And the fact that the audience was that crazed meant that a guy like Abdullah could stay there for an extended period of time if he needed to. And that he knew he had that in his back pocket at all times, which allowed him to say, hey, Joe Blanchard, I'm going to work for you for 30 days and then I'm out. Hey, Oli, give me 2 months and then I'm out of here. And it's funny because Vince Sr. never wanted to book him because...
Yeah.
I don't even think he did a cup of coffee in the WWF, did he?
Never.
Again, they had Kamala, they had Andre. I don't think they needed Abdullah. They had Terry Funk for a cup of coffee.
They had booked the Sheik to work with Bruno. They worked Brody to work Bruno. They had booked Dick the Bruiser, and he got banned from New York.
But I think that goes to the strength of Abdullah the Butcher that he didn't have to go to New York.
And that was the point I was going to illustrate.
Right.
Despite never working there, and it's the only territory left standing, essentially, he's still known worldwide. He's in their Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
What more can you say about that gimmick? It was genius, and he made such a success of it that nobody will ever be able to replicate it.
I'm just thinking about his Hall of Fame package, and they're just like, can't use this, can't use this, can't use this. We can use the same 3 images. That's it.
I also think that if you want to talk about Abdullah and you want to be fair in your evaluation of his career, it doesn't matter which territory you're referring to, whether it's Florida, whether it's Jim Crockett, whether it's world class. Abdullah certainly made a name for himself all over the world, but Abdullah's best presentation was always with Gary Hart.
100%. His best orator, his best hype man, Gary. And, talk about one of the great minds of the 70s, Gary Hart. Sure.
So we're talking Stampede now?
No, Gary was with him in Texas mostly. Would make the trip with him to Puerto Rico from time to time.
Okay.
But yeah, Gary was really Abdullah's mouthpiece in Texas for the most. I think he did in Georgia too, Gavin, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that was where Gary and Dusty really started their long-term feud.
And I know they handed him off to Bearcat Wright at a certain point too.
Yeah.
But yeah, Gary Hart, who's probably one of the more underappreciated talents, because just like Abdullah, never had a run in New York. But Gary knew how to get Abdullah over as a scary son of a gun, to the point where people were afraid for Bruiser Brody's health against him.
Yeah.
God. Gavin, an hour from now, you're going to be hanging out with the wife, thinking about the kid, and it's going to occur to you, shit, I wish I had said this in the hour and a half we had talking about old school wrestling. So I'm giving you that opportunity now. This is we're talking old school wrestling. We're talking the 70s. What's the last thing you want to say that if I don't say this, I feel like I've wasted my time on this podcast? What's your final thought?
I think in wrestling, maybe more than any other form of entertainment, it's easy to dismiss the older stuff because in boxing, everybody knows that the 70s were great. Some of the greatest movies and television shows and albums ever produced came from the 1970s.
I keep telling my son the 70s was the best decade for movies ever.
And wrestling, it's easy to say, oh, well, things have evolved to the point that stuff doesn't work. It's passed by. And that's simply not true. There's so much outstanding stuff that they do have footage of that you can go back and watch. And if you want to see what genuine heat looks like, if you want to see what maybe not the flashiest ring work, but the most believable ring work of any generation looks like. And if you want to see the foundation of what the modern product became all the way from the 80s, even until now. You can find it in multiple territories from the 1970s and into the early 1980s before it became the truly modernized product that so many people fell in love with. Had it not been for the guys that we talked about and more that we didn't have time to talk about tonight, the product as we know it would not exist. So if you're any type of fan of the modern sport, take some time, go back, find some stuff from the 70s, watch it, and appreciate where the sport came from.